Ed Harrow of the show that still doesn't have a name, but HKM calls it Ed Talks, and hopefully I'm not going to talk very much, and hopefully our guests here are going to do most of the talking. But we're here today to talk about how house building has changed over the past 50 or so years. And I just learned that recently there was another change in the building code, so I'm sure there'll be conversations about how the building code has changed. My own knowledge of house building is very limited. I do have experience with a house that was built in 1750 and it's still standing, and if a building inspector walked into it today and looked at it, they would be aghast at how things were done back then. But I point out that the house is still standing, floor joists that are built on trees that are about this big around, things like that. Foundations of loose stones. But anyway, we have three gentlemen here that are known to many people here in Hopkinton. We have Mr. Shepard, Michael Shepard, who grew up in the house that we live in, and we can compare a few notes. I learned that my office is in Bonnie's bedroom. We have Bob Winter, who has probably done work for some of you in town. And we have Chris Nation of the Nation family, who've done lots of building here in town in more recent times. And I'm not quite sure where to start, but I think we probably want to start with the long ago days, which would be either Mike or Bob kind of talking about what it was like to build a house. And I'm not talking about finding the place to build a house or doing the prep work of like a subdivision. I'm talking about here's a chunk of land, we're going to build a house there. What has to happen? What did happen?
Well, I guess I'll start off. I'm probably the oldest. I'm getting so I'm the oldest at every meeting.
Don't be so sure about that.
But as a kid, my dad was a framer. His father was a builder, and that's all I ever wanted to do. I wanted to be a framer, and I was the oldest son, and neither of my parents had graduated high school. When I graduated high school, I was going to have to go to college, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be a framer, and so I picked Fitchburg State College, which had a shop teacher program. So I went through it, I did college, I got my degree as a shop teacher, and after I got out of the service, I just started building, remodeling, and additions. My brother and I, Bob, probably did 8 or 10 custom homes. And later on, as I got older, we did pretty much all additions. I'd design it, go out and get prices, give the people estimates, and if they were okay with it, we did it. And we had a good time at it. Back when my dad was framing and we built the house on Spring Lane, the builders in town, there was Jerry Thorpe, Dick Bauco was one, John Ryan was another one. But back then, most of the homes were little ranches and capes. We didn't really have subdivisions then. I think the first subdivision that was actually a project that I'm aware of was the one Joe Clolla did, which is now Charlesview. When I was a kid, 100 years ago, Charlesville was the neighborhood in Hopkins. Again, it was split entry ranches, capes. Teddy Gasson had a lot to do in Charlesview as well, mostly colonial homes, and he was really good at that. Also at the time, about that time, a little bit later, John Hackinson, again, mostly colonial homes and mostly custom homes. He did a nice job. But over time, initially, back when your house was built, there was the building code was the Hopkinton Building Code. And I forget the year, it was probably, late 70s, early 80s, and the town adopted what was called the Boca Code, which is kind of a countrywide building code. It got standardized things. So, the builders, again, until they got into the subdivision business, it was usually one off here, one off there. They go down to town and go to the town hall. We had a building inspector back when I built my house in '74. Buddy Freeze was the building inspector. And
I
it
have a
was funny.
story about Bud Freeze.
Well, Buddy Freeze was
Everybody has
Buddy,
a story about Buddy.
Buddy was a
Freeze.
character. I go into town hall now. I'm teaching in Weston. I'm teaching, wood shop and technical drawing and stuff. And I designed my house. And again, it was a colonial. It's a salt box. And my wife wanted something right out of Sturbridge Village, and that's what she's got. That looks like that today. And Buddy Freeze, I brought the plans. And who did these plans? I did. Oh, get out of here. Get me some real plans. So that night, my dad, who knew Buddy from hunting, called him up and said, "Hey, that's my kiddo Mike." Next day, Buddy called up and said, "Get your ass in here." Oh, sorry. And
Get your buddy.
we'll issue your permit. but it was pretty easy back then because the codes were, pretty liberal. Structurally, my dad used to say these old houses that you talk about from the 1700s, 1800s, my dad used to say, habit holds those houses together. They weren't built like any standard that we have today. Windows had no headers, doors had no headers, but again, none of them sagged, none of them fell down. Habit holds them together. And but that was pretty much it. We've got to the point now, at least from my perspective, where we have an international building code, and it has a lot of standards in it that are pretty tough to meet, and that's why the houses are getting more expensive. And that's what these guys deal with every day. But that's about my 2 cents.
Okay, this is a good time for me to tell my Bud Freeze story.
Yeah.
So when we were house hunting, there were several things that we wanted. And one of the things that we wanted was a place for my cook stove.
Yeah.
And so your house,
It's a wooden
Yeah.
cook stove, isn't it?
no, the stove is not wooden.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
The
Wood
stove is
stove.
iron.
No, but it uses wood
Yeah.
fuel. Okay, I got you.
And so
Why is that?
the house that Mike's dad built had a lovely fireplace in the living room that still has never been used.
Yeah.
And Cheryl's dad was a general contractor, and his mason came and poked a hole into the back of that chimney and did all the brickwork and everything. And when I talked to Bud Freeze about this project, and I said, what we're going to do, and he asked about the stove, and he said, it's not one of those Taiwanese stoves, is it? I said, no. Is it UL approved? I said, no, it was built in like 1890 by the Sill Stove Works. Oh, well, then the good Lord approved it. Then when he comes to look at the job, we had a pump organ, and he starts talking about Don Phipps.
Yep.
I said, oh, Don Phipps, the guy, and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, he knew Don Phipps, who has had the organ that's been donated to the, I can't think of the name of the theater in Worcester.
Hanover.
Hanover Theater. He donated the organ to the Hanover Theater. So if you go to the Hanover Theater for silent movies, you'll get to hear Don Phipps's organ. Okay, enough of Bud Freeze.
I don't know. I'd like to tell a Bud Freeze story.
Okay.
Everybody has one of those.
Bud was a really good guy, but this is when you get your building license on a grandfather clause. You didn't have to take the test or anything. You could just go in and apply for it, and you would get it, right? So I had been withholding, not wanting to do this next legal step for some strange reason. So I put it off. Finally, I realized that I was doing enough work in town that this is the way it was going to go. So I applied for my builder's license and went to Worcester that day. They scheduled a thing where you had to go and you took a quick test and then you would get your building permit. So at the time I was already doing work. So after the test, I went up to the inspector who was giving the test. Said, "Look, I have an issue." I said, "I'm working on a job now. What happens if I get a building inspector comes by and shuts me down?" He says, "Well, look, here's my card," and he gave me a phone number on the back of it, and if anything happens, just give the official the card. So I said, "Okay, great." So I'm on my way home, and I get there, and there's a message from a guy who was working with me, who was on the job while I was taking my tests in Worcester, and he said, "Bob, you better call the building inspector right away." So I call Bud Freeze, and he says, "Are you doing this job?" Blah, 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 blah. And I said, "Oh, yeah, that's me." He says, "Well, you don't have a permit." And so I went down there and I was talking to him. He said, draw up some plans and come down and talk to me. So I drew up a quick plan and went down there and was talking to him. And then he said, okay, you know, we'll do the permit and where's your license? And I looked at him and I said, well, I feel like a driver's got a learning permit who just got into an accident. And he looked at me and goes, what do you mean? And I handed him this card. He says, what's this? And I said, well, I just took my test for the builder's license today, and the guy who gave me the test said, if I get into a problem, I can just give you this card. So he just kind of like went off the deep end and said, get out of here. I'll have the permit in a day. But it was like, oh my God, what an introduction, you know. So, but anyway.
So when you guys were building houses, I mean, I remember when my neighbor as a kid put an addition on his house and a truck came in from the lumber yard and dumped a load of lumber on the ground. And that was that. And yet I see today that stuff comes into the job site that's, you know, it's, roof trusses are all done, things are, if you will, prefabbed. So I'm sure back when you were starting out, I mean, you weren't there with a handsaw cutting stuff, but.
Electric saws
yeah,
were around then. That was an innovation. But I don't know, I'm talking about, Mike came in it from a different direction. I didn't have someone who was already in the trades. And I had been in the service, and then afterwards I got into a VISTA program where I was doing some low-income organizing, and then got out of that and decided that my grandfather was a patent maker for 50 years, so it came time to decide what the heck I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I said, carpentry sounds like a good idea. So I started hiring on with different framing crews, and we would frame the house, and then you would sheathe the house, then you would side the house, put on half-inch, it would be half-inch plywood at the time.
So when you were working, it was all plywood for sheathing?
Yeah, yeah. But they were also still using 1x8 ledger board for the decks. So you would do that, and then you would do the siding, you would do the window installs, the door installs, you would do the roofing, and then when the kitchen cabinets came around, you know, someone else would do the sheetrock, and the electricians obviously would do the electrical stuff. But otherwise, we did mostly the whole thing. When you walked away, there was a completed house, which, you know, it's not the case anymore. Everybody specialized.
So, Bob, when you started, was it boards for sheathing rather than plywood? I mean,
it was boards,
yeah.
and you hit it right on the head. My job and my brother both worked for my dad summers in high school and whatever. And our job was, he had hand saws.
Yeah.
He was one of the last ones. He called it a skill saw, and that was the name of it, skill saw. He bought it from White's down in Framingham, White's
Okay,
Hardware.
well, hardware, sure.
And it was a power saw, but he had hand saws that you could shave with. Every week he brought them down, Gene Sharpening down in Framingham. He'd have set up one set of hand saws, and he'd pick up the ones from last week. And but Bob and I, you know, my dad and his brother would sheathe the house, and it was boards, and they'd run the boards along on the corners and over the windows. And our job, the donkey work, was to cut with the handsaw, cut out the windows and stuff. But in terms of plywood, you know, I think my dad was probably 65 years old before he trusted plywood. He was old school. He did boards, and he did sway braces, and he did all the stuff that, like, old things. And,
explain what a sway brace is.
Yeah.
Sway brace is.
Sway brace is a diagonal brace on the wall that keeps it from doing this. Plywood pretty much does that by itself now. And even plywood has changed now. You got oriented strand board, you got that green
Zip.
and you know, that pretty much does the same thing, and it's all approved under the building code. But in terms of, you know, Bob and I, you know, started with a hammer and nail framing, and then nail guns came along, and we were part of the last ones with nail gun because we couldn't compete in time with framers that
Use nail guns.
use nail guns. So we were probably the last ones to get those, and you know, pretty much appreciated it after that. But you know, that's how things have changed over time. But
so what is the green stuff that's used for sheathing now?
Just comes with a vapor barrier installed on it, zip plywood. So and they make it for the roof. That'd be brown.
Yeah. It has tape. You've seen it with the black tape over the joints, and a lot of the things about the building code now is losing air through the walls. And the zip sheathing, you put the black tape over it, and that helps prevent losing that air.
And then you have to set up an infiltration system to suck some air in and take
Oh yes,
some air out.
no, that's all
Houses
part of
are
the
so
code
damn
now
tight.
too. As we sit through town meeting, they make it better and better.
I want to make sure that I get my chance.
Yeah.
All right,
About
sir.
the Freeze,
All right.
Mr. Freeze story. Just hearing the more experienced guys talking does remind me. I came into this at the, tail end of what you're saying, and it was I would have been riding in a passenger seat or perhaps the back of the truck with my dad, and we would go see Mr. Freeze, and it would be something like, well, Chris, I'm not sure how this one's going to go, but we got to go see the building inspector. And we would go down to, that was at the time he would have been, that I remember him, was in the Woodville Fire Station. And so he had an office down there. I never dealt with him directly. I would have been too young, but certainly recall him. And
Well, what's your story?
that's it.
That's
Just,
it.
You'll lead us all up.
Shoot a ball.
But what I'm hearing sounds like, it was like the Wild West. So I think I maybe even have a little sympathy for him in the sense that look what he was dealing with, a bunch of guys that did whatever they felt like, which is certainly what I would like to do. I'd like to go back to that, but truthfully, I think I enjoy the more structured way we have it now. You have an expectation and you follow through, and things have gotten a little
Much more
I think
professional.
a little
It's
bit
much more professional.
crazy maybe in this last couple of years with, I've seen it start where you could draw a plan on a napkin and get a permit. And now it's a whole nother task just to get the permit. Sometimes it's like getting the job is harder than doing the job. It's certainly changed. It's
Yeah.
bandwidth of what you need to do
So
is
you're
shocking.
in some of your stuff, you're bringing in trusses and stuff like that are pre-assembled, or is that more like the Toll Brothers that does that?
I've used trusses very sparingly. They've been used on some condos that we did, not in Hopkinton. And then I've done one house in Hopkinton with trusses, and it was sort of a little trial run, and it was a really simple house. It was just a plain rectangle with one small dormer on the front, so it was conducive to the trusses worked well. The problem you have is mechanicals and other things, so sometimes the trusses just don't work for a bigger house from my perspective. The truss has to become specialized where it's got a block out for it so you can walk through it and it can carry weight and a furnace, and I could go on and on.
Well,
Continue on.
So I'm not a fan of trusses for what we do. We try to make it something a little more special, I guess.
so my limited knowledge of house building, like I said, it's really extremely limited. But I heard about these things.
Yep.
And that the presence of these things has made for some significant differences in building houses. Is there truth to that, or is it?
Strength by design, right?
Yeah.
Have these taken away some of the skill that was required to
I don't think
assemble, like where rafters come together with top sill plate and things like that?
Well, you got to understand that the international code is based on what happens in California, what happens in Florida. And
We haven't
eventually-
even left the United States yet, and you're saying
eventually-
international.
And eventually it all comes up to Massachusetts because we adopted the same code. So the wind issues, which is what that primary is used for, to hold stuff together, is applied. I don't think such flew apart before. Maybe the way they used to do it in Florida, I can see how that could probably happen, but I don't think that could happen, for example, to your house. It was built the old way without that.
Mhm.
Is it better? Probably, for that event that is going to happen once in 1,000 years. But the thing about the codes is they change based upon something that happens somewhere. I suspect the fires in California, we're going to see something about
Fire
that
code,
in
yeah,
terms of
yeah.
of fire-resistant sheathing, fire-resistant roofing. But
Yeah.
even though the likelihood of the California scenario is not that great here. One thing I want to tell you about Buddy Freeze is back when my brother and I worked for my dad, aside from cutting out the boards, which was a big pain in the butt, we'd nail off the strapping.
Oh,
You know, so he'd build us a little stool which we'd kick around the floor. And we'd nail off the strapping, which the plasterboard is nailed to. And it's a pain in the neck because you're upside down.
Yep.
And it's just not a normal, and you'd be tired. And my dad would say, "Who's doing the strapping by the stairs?" I'd say, "I'm doing it there." He says, "Don't nail it off." I say, "Why?" He says, "Because when Buddy comes, I want something from him to find, and then we'll talk about hunting." that was the way it was. That's the way it was, and I'll never forget that.
I learned to be ambidextrous and
Yeah.
strapping because this arm would die and I'd just turn around and go this way
Yeah.
until I could go back to I'm lefty, so I would be doing it backwards anyways.
Yeah, but everything with time has changed. Your house has what we used to call rock lath.
Yeah.
It was like sheetrock, except it was harder, except the pieces were like 2 feet by 3 feet.
Yeah.
And the lath guys, that was what came after actually wood lath.
Yeah.
And the lath guys would come in and they'd put up that. And then, of course, the plaster guys would put on 3 coats on it. And, you know, and then after that, of course, we ended up getting into drywall and blue board, and that's pretty much what we have now. I think in my personal opinion, because I haven't been involved in the inspection business for quite a while, is that the big name builders, the Toll Brothers, the Pulte Brothers, and they're all across the country. You know, what they build is something nice to look at, but they also, because they're a national company, they know the code backwards and forwards, and they know how to save money. So if you have the option of having 2x4s 2 foot on center instead of 16-inch center, in every case they'll do 2 feet, because one guy explained to me we save 25 studs per houses, and we got 2,500 houses a year. It's a big savings. So, and always what you do is you go look through any project that Pulte or Toll Brothers does. The fronts of the houses look gorgeous. The sides are usually vinyl. They're nothing special, or the backs, that's what, but it's what you see in front. In terms of good houses, they're great. But if you take a builder like, you know, Chris and his dad, the whole house is nice.
Yeah.
And they don't care about, I can go 2 foot on center. They know that you know, 16 is better, so they do it that way. That's the difference of what you get. I'm not a big fan of the big, you know, countrywide builders. Not like the regular guys.
You talk about how codes are driven by events. Are codes driven more by insurance companies, or are codes driven by people that come up with ideas and do some lobbying and get bills passed?
Both. I would say both. For instance, the roof, you used to be able to put 2 and 3 layers of shingles on a roof. Insurance companies found that fire damage was really great when you had more than 1 layer of shingle on a roof. The inside damage to the house was really a lot more, and the firefighters couldn't break through and allow the air out. So they changed the code, worked on the code to have 1 layer of shingles, no more than 2. And so that's where that particular influence came in. But then otherwise you have other engineers and other people in the trades that work in a committee when somebody will come up with a problem, and then they'll discuss it and come up with a way to solve it, so to speak, or create another problem in
So
the course of their actions.
we have things like glue lam beams that you can get for, like when we put the addition on our house, we couldn't get, I don't know, the 2x10s, 2x12s for the roof. Couldn't get them over, I don't know, 20 feet, so that we had to have a knee wall to support it. Whereas today, you could have probably got those as, and what's the word for the other beam? They'll have like 2x3s and plywood in the middle. Those are called a what?
Like an eye joist.
Whisper joists.
A what?
Be like
A
an
whisper
I-joist, or
Yeah.
I'm assuming you're saying an I-joist.
Yeah, well, I mean, they
Yeah.
look like an I-beam, but made out of wood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't know what they were called.
There's manufacturer, different names have many different names, right?
And I assume that those kinds of things, the changes in your, and for lack of a better word, your base materials have had a significant change in house building.
I think the products have come such a long way that
Yeah.
it's wonderful. I remember building houses, 30 years ago, and
No.
and the tile would be cracked in the whole line through the whole room, and it was just because some floor joist went crazy. And nowadays you're getting your manufactured I-joist or your Versalam, and the stuff is true and stays true, and the floor's level, and there's no crown, or a crown doesn't appear, and it's you can really make a reliable, consistent product.
So you wouldn't be doing things like taking your 2x10s and checking them to see which way they're
Oh,
carved and so
there's
forth?
there's
All that?
still a lot of that.
Really?
But when it comes to making a choice, if you've got a floor system, if you can do it with something that's quote unquote an engineered floor versus natural lumber, it's the engineered floor is always the way to go. You can have one floor joist go from front to back. Thing could be 40 feet long, and there's no break in the middle, and things are just straight and true, and they stay that way.
Yeah,
It's
subfloor's
huge.
glued down.
So we're closing in on our half an hour. We're ready to go build houses. I think we've gotten every one of these I've done. I always wish you had more time because things get more interesting as you go along. But I appreciate your willingness to come and talk about this. And if the fan club calls up and says we want to know more about house building, I know where to get a hold of you.
Talk to Mike.
You got 3 new guys.
No, I actually have. I have one other guy, but I've been yelled at for having 3 people. They say that's too many. So if I was to bring in a fourth, Terrell Ramage, I don't know if you guys know him.
No.
I don't know if he does any building in town, but he does that. So anyway, we got to sign off. So
All right.
thank you all for watching, and I hope you learned something. And if you got questions, those are the guys to ask, not me. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to be here.